Welcome to the Neurodiverse Teacher Podcast. Today, my guest is Gina Simm. Gina is the author of Heart to Heart and has been an early childhood educator for over 30 years. Her background in Montessori education and children's theater launched her into the world of public teaching, where she has spent most of her career as a first grade teacher. One of those years, Gina was even spent in China teaching English. So most significantly, her knowledge of nonviolent communication has transformed her classroom into a place where systems of the heart create a child-centered environment for moving through conflict. Welcome, Gina, to the Neurodiverse Teacher Podcast.
Thank you.
I'm really excited to have you here and to have a conversation today. And so one of the first things I want to jump into before we talk about your book, some of your work, is setting a foundation for my listeners that may not be familiar with a Montessori education, because I have a feeling that might play into our conversation a little bit today. Would you mind explaining a little bit more about the Montessori approach to learning?
Yeah, well, there's Montessori schools all over the world, so you may have heard the word. And it's started by a woman named Maria Montessori back in the 1800s. And the whole idea is to create a very conscious environment for learning. And this is an early childhood setting, starting with 3 to 6 year olds. She believed that kids needed to learn in multi-age groups. So there was the 3 to 6 year old environment, the 6 to 9, and it went up into threes like that, all the way up into like high school. The biggest thing, my biggest takeaway that I really loved about that philosophy was what was called the prepared environment. So as a teacher, you're always thinking about every little object, every little shade of color, everything that's going to be influencing the student. So people that have an aesthetic priority in their world really respond very well to this. And you're teaching, you're giving these little lessons to the students that are very well thought through. So that has influenced me a lot. And that was a long, long time ago. That was sort of the beginning of it all for me. And as you said, it's been a long time, like over 30 years. So hopefully that answers your question.
No, that was a great answer. And thank you for explaining that. I think that a lot of people don't realize that you're right. Maybe they've heard the word and that Montessori schools exist, but they don't know the approach that it takes to Montessori and how it differs, and that it's a much more hands-on type of learning experience compared to what might be other traditional elementary or early school settings. So thank you for sharing that information. I appreciate that. Well,
Yes.
Now that we've set that foundation, I want to jump right into asking you a little bit more about your book, Heart to Heart. I'm very excited to hear your take on it. What was your inspiration for writing it? And what are you hoping people will get out of by reading Heart to Heart?
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm hoping I'll just jump right to the end, but I'll try to get back to the beginning too. I'm hoping that any teacher or parent, caregiver, grandparent, camp counselor can pick up this book and use it like a cookbook. So it's actually designed to be a manual, like a manual in your glove compartment for your car, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that when you're trying to deal with some sort of behavior, which, that's one of the biggest challenges when you have children in front of you, either one or a group. You'll have a sense of what you can do, and it's 3 systems, and let's see, they're all designed to keep the connection going that we are all longing for with our children. So yeah, that's the outcome. How I got started was I learned, well, as a teacher, I was always right from the beginning, I realized that the social emotional learning was key to everything. And that if we didn't have that in place, the academics couldn't happen. Nothing could happen. So I, it was just always in the back of my mind, how can I do this? And trying a lot of things and succeeding and trying a lot of things and failing. And over the years, just, seeing what I could do to have a classroom that was more based on compassion. And so what ended up happening is I learned nonviolent communication, which is another thing you might want to ask me about. And that's sort of like Montessori. That's a thing out in the world, started by a person named Marshall Rosenberg, based on really the principles of nonviolence, which really came into fruition with Gandhi, and then went to Martin Luther King, and so on. So those principles, when I learned those principles, it's really the principles of compassion, which is what I was, always wanting. It all sort of fell into place for what I wanted in my classroom. So I use those principles to create what I talk of. I've been saying an infrastructure for compassion, and that's how I started writing my book. People were saying, "Wow, you've got these things going on. Maybe you should write a book." And I was like, yeah, no, I'm not an author, that kind of thing. But, when I really put my mind to it, it turned out to be an easy thing to do. And that's how it ended up happening.
Wow, that's fantastic, and I love that. I love that it was kind of through your own practice, your own toolbox that you had created for your teaching practice, that you were able to kind of unearth and create this really wonderful thing that hopefully other teachers and parents can use to really make those connections with their children and their students. Now, let me ask you, you talked about, or you brought up nonviolent communication, which is definitely something I wanted to talk to you about. And you talked about these 9 principles. Would you mind sharing what some of those are, so that if someone who's not familiar with nonviolent communication, they can have a deeper idea of what does that mean? What does that look like? How do you instill or practice nonviolent communication?
Yes. Okay. So yeah, the principles, like here's an example of a principle, a nonviolent communication principle. That when we have feelings. Okay, let's just start with feelings.
Mhm.
And one of the principles is that feelings come and feelings go. And of course we've all experienced that, but when you actually say that to somebody, it makes them like, oh, right, yeah, that's true, and can give us a little comfort, right?
Mhm.
And so that's an example of one principle. Another principle is that needs, um, which are different than feelings. And by needs, an example of a need would be the need to belong, the need to have competence, the need for fun and play. All of these things are universal. So that's a principle, that needs are universal. Everyone all over the world have needs, including our pets.
Mhm.
And not just survival needs, but what we would call thriving needs. So I've taken there's a lot of them. I've taken those principles and turned them into little lessons in my book. So there's 14 lessons.
Mhm.
So it's like a curriculum. And
Right.
the first lesson is called Feelings Come and Feelings Go. And the way that lesson is taught is through a children's book. So there's a book. You read the book, you have little discussion points, and then there's a follow-up activity. And in the case of that little lesson, Feelings Come and Feelings Go, the follow-up activity is making these little feelings cards. I can, if you're watching this and not just listening, you can get a sense of these cards that we've got, stressed and happy and sad and upset and worried and disappointed and curious and confused. You're teaching young children an emotional vocabulary
Mhm.
beyond just mad, glad, sad. And once they learn that vocabulary, of course, they can communicate with you about what's going on internally. And then there's these are these little cards I've designed, but then there are needs cards. So this is like, what is this? Fun and play, safety and trust, privacy and alone time, ability. So you get the idea.
Oh my gosh, I am just so I'm blown away by this. I truly am blown away by this. And you said something earlier too that really resonates with me is you have to take care of a child's social emotional learning essentially first before you take care of the academic, which is something that I have preached through my entire career as an educator, that as a teacher, I can teach, I can help children learn. But if they're not available for learning because of whatever circumstances going on in their life, then there's not much I can do. So that social emotional piece has always been important to me, getting that instilled in a child first, so that essentially they can be available then for that academic or that learning piece. So I'm curious to know, how has this practice of nonviolent communication shaped your students and the way that they learn? How have you seen, I'm assuming probably this was not your practice when you first started as a teacher. So having had the experience of not having this and then having this as part of your approach to teaching, what have you seen as the major difference or impact on your students by having these practices?
The main difference is that, they can talk about what's going on inside. And that's just amazing. To think about. Like, I remember, I'm retired now. I've been retired for 3 years, but towards the end of my last year teaching, on the first day of school, I had a first grade student, actually someone who was on the spectrum, and he came in and memorized all the feelings and needs on the wall. I have them, really big, in the classroom, and didn't realize that he had, but it was evident because in our first morning meeting, he raised his hand and said, "Miss Gina, I feel lonely and I need friendship." Boom, like, whoa. Uh, yeah, that was just phenomenal. That's just a really amazing example. I don't even know him. I'm getting to know him. And he was able to tell me, just by memorizing these things, which is one of his, fortes, what's going on inside. And the whole class got to hear that. So we were all, the compassion was already starting just by having these things on the wall. I hadn't taught any lessons or anything. So that's a pretty powerful example.
No, it is. I have goosebumps. I have goosebumps because most students, especially a student on the spectrum, depending on where they land on the spectrum, sometimes that communication piece is so hard. They have the feelings, but not the way of verbalizing to you what those feelings are. And that's sometimes where I think teachers don't realize that's where you might see some behaviors or you might see some withdrawal. And oftentimes it's that manifestation of having these feelings, but not sure how to communicate them. So you're giving this medium to children to be able to recognize those feelings and then communicate them in a way that's not like what I like to call like the squeaky wheel situation. It's a verbal communication rather than an outward action or even an inward action of some kind.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's really everything. That's everything we want too as caregivers. We want to know what's going on inside. So yeah, that's one of many outcomes. Another thing that I designed is something called a wheel of choice, and I know it sounds, like, "Whoa, what's that?"
I love
And
it. I want to hear about it.
basically, you're giving kids, you teach them all these different strategies for dealing with distress. And so on the wheel, there's something called, well, there's empathy, giving or receiving empathy using these cards. That's one thing you can do when you're in some sort of, distress. Another thing you can do is take a break. You can make a request. That's an MVC principle. You can express an appreciation. So you have all these choices. And so when there is something up, they don't have to just come to the teacher and the teacher feels like they have to solve the problem. That's the other thing, is this, dependency on an adult to solve problems. And one of the biggest takeaways that I found when I started developing an NVC classroom was that if I just say something like, "Wow, that sounds hard," often enough, that's really all they need. They don't need me to suggest a solution. They're often running like, "Oh, thank you, bye,"
It's that feeling validation that you're providing.
Yeah, all I'm letting them know is that I'm caring about what they're going through. Um, sometimes, I'll be in the middle of teaching a lesson and a student will look distressed
Mhm.
or even raise their hand and say, you know, I'm sad, well, I'm teaching math. What am I supposed to do? Right. I've got the other 20 kids sitting there waiting for, the next part of the lesson. But I can say, oh, go get some feelings cards, pick out three needs cards. And then once you get them, come back right away, hand them to me, and then I'll take a look. And it's like clockwork, they know what to do. Already they're feeling better.
Mhm.
They go get the cards, they hand them to me. Meanwhile, I'm still teaching, teaching, teaching. I take a look, and then I look at the student and say, wow, no wonder. Got it. And then keep teaching.
I I love this. By the way, I am just eating this up. This is just amazing to me as somebody who has focused on mental health in the education setting. I'm really loving this, and I think one of the biggest things that I'm hoping teachers, I really hope teachers are listening to this, is it sounds like you've created a system where kids can not only recognize what their feelings are, but there's a way for them to communicate that to you, for you to understand, for you to validate, but your lesson can continue. Because I think that's one of the biggest issues, at least in the research I've done, is that teachers don't always recognize what to do with students when, or they don't even just recognize what mental health looks like oftentimes. And so what you're doing is you're providing this kind of, I see it as a bridge that students are able to kind of say, these are what my needs are. And so a teacher doesn't, it takes the guesswork out of it. A teacher doesn't have to necessarily be immersed in mental health or know exactly mental health, but they just need to be able to communicate. They need to know the value of validating a student's feelings. And so I actually see your practice as something that's incredibly needed right now. I know you said that you retired 3 years ago, but I'm sure you've heard about the amount of mental health that's going around in the education setting right now, and how not just teacher, but student needs in the mental health sector are so significant right now.
Yeah.
And I really see this as almost like a first line of defense for children to really be able to
Mhm.
express what they're feeling to teachers, and taking some of that guesswork or the fact that a lot of students go overlooked and not recognize that there are feelings or needs that are going on, and to a point where it becomes almost like this snowball effect. It's gotten so large, it's gotten so big. And so how would it be, how could you see a teacher taking what you have created and really putting it into their daily practice to make sure that they're getting the most out of being able to recognize students' feelings and emotions in the, excuse me, in the classroom?
Yeah, well, that's why I wrote the book so that they wouldn't. I mean, I do a lot of workshops, but the book is designed so that you can just pick this up. I mean, there's so many wonderful books out there for parents and teachers, but they're huge, and they're
Mhm.
like a lot of narrative. This is very practical, and it's skinny, like, it's very thin. That's on purpose. So, yeah, there's three systems. One is the little lessons I've told you. And so once you teach those lessons, everybody knows what empathy is. They don't just have to rely on the teacher to get empathy, they can give it to each other. And that's the other thing, is that once you have the systems in place, it becomes sort of a well-greased machine. The
Mhm.
second system is the wheel of choice that I told you about. And then the third system is like a meeting, a
Mhm.
problem solving meeting. And those are done with the whole class. And so it's a community problem solving event that takes place on a regular basis. And because it's a social emotional curriculum, it's in the schedule. And of course, I'm just talking about the classroom, not families, but the
Mhm.
same thing can happen in families, just less formal. And so it's in the schedule. So after our science lesson is our heart talk lesson. So it's just part of learning, and they take it very seriously because it's in the schedule.
I love that. I love that. So now that we know that these exist, I'm sure my listeners want to know, if they wanted to learn more about you, about your work, about how to get the book, what would be the best way for them to go about either connecting with you, finding out about more about the system, buying the system? What would be the best way for them to go about doing so?
Really, my website, is the best place. It's teachingfromyourheart.org. So org is important, and those are the two things that people miss.
Mm-hmm.
Teachingfromyourheart.org. And it has a lot in there. It has some songs that I've written with the kids. It has, of course, a way to buy my book. You can buy it, obviously through Amazon, but people who don't want to use Amazon, um, a lot of people are not wanting to support Amazon. You can use Barnes and Noble. You can buy it directly from me. I have the empathy cards for sale as well. And then now recently I've designed these posters that are basically the empathy cards in poster form. And let's see, there's some videos there on empathy sessions with kids. There's one with an 11-year-old and a 9-year-old just giving each other empathy using the cards. There's classroom videos from around the world. There's one in Denmark, one in France, a middle school. Anyway, yeah, there's a lot of things there, articles I've written. And so that would be the best place. And then you can email me, and I do workshops. I do personal one-on-one coaching. But yeah, the book is really designed to not need me at all, though it's great to flesh it out, with a workshop.
That is fantastic. And I think before we started recording today, you were telling me you have a couple other things going on, sound like podcasts or different projects. So could you share with my listeners anything that I didn't get a chance to touch on or ask you about so far that you're currently working on? I want to make sure you get a chance to share about that great work too, because I'm really loving everything that you've said so far today.
Yeah. Well, there's a podcast I did called Reading with Your Kids. So that podcast focuses on children's books and children's authors. And because I use so many children's books to teach the lessons, it's a good thing to listen to. Let's see, what else? I work with the University of Maine on a regular basis with their professional development program. So I'm teaching a lot, doing a lot of workshops for teachers. And yeah, that's all I can think of right now that would reach a large audience. But yeah, there's a lot of little projects that I'm doing.
But
Not
that's
just,
fantastic.
I know I'm working with, this is a fun thing that I'm doing now that's not about children, but it's about nonviolent communication. I'm partnering with someone to work with the police department in our town, with a contingent of the police that are responding to nonviolent crime in our town. And those are programs that are happening all over the country right now. So that's another thing to, that's related. Everything's related to
Mhm.
feelings and needs, right?
No, absolutely. But this all sounds like amazing work. And let me actually ask you, I know we talked about a little bit about nonviolent communication, what it is, how it's made an impact in your classroom. If somebody wanted to know more or learn more about the principles or nonviolent, is that something that's outlined within your book, or do you have a book that maybe you suggest somebody go and read, or an author that really touches on nonviolent communication so someone could immerse themselves and have a deeper understanding of it?
Yeah, there's a lot of books out there. I would say go to the Center for Nonviolent Communication website. That's CNVC, Center for Nonviolent Communication. Or you can just Google NVC and you'll find a lot of ways to get resources. And my, the book I would recommend is the book that Marshall Rosenberg wrote himself. It's skinny like my book, and it just lays it out in a very basic way, in a very compelling way. I mean, he died like maybe 10 years ago, but
Mhm.
he started writing in the 70s, and he's the person that put all this together, Marshall Rosenberg. And I forget the name of his book, Communication for Life, Nonviolent Communication, something like life enriching, something about life. I can't remember.
No, I'm sure you've given enough information that somebody could Google it, as you said, or look it up. But I just wanted to make sure that they had an idea of where to look for a little bit more information, because it sounds like it's definitely a concept that has a strong foundation in your work. So I think it's an important one for people to look a little more into, and other ways that nonviolent communication could be applied to maybe their work or the way that they interact with individuals.
Yeah, just another thing, some people don't have a good response to the word nonviolence for
Mm.
obvious reasons, like, why would I need nonviolent communication? I'm not violent. But to get a little understanding about where that word came from, it's really came from Gandhi. It was a Hindi word that meant something like, nonviolence meant something like open-hearted, therefore no room for violence.
Mm.
It really comes from a place of compassion, not in the way that we think of it. Though if you do think about it, violence can come in many forms that are very subtle, that are not in the way that we think of as physical, very aggressive violence. So, yeah, a little bit about that. People like to know about that. Some people have taken the word nonviolence out of communication and called it compassionate communication, effective communication, because
Mm.
of the reaction people get from the word nonviolence.
Even though it's not necessarily, what you're saying is it doesn't necessarily represent what people might think it does. It's really
Yes.
just more about the style of communication, not that it's violent per se.
Yeah. I mean, if you love Gandhi and Martin Luther King,
Mm.
just add communication to that idea. And that's how I think of it.
I like that. I think that's a good analogy for people to really understand what that's promoting. Well, before we wrap up here, Gina, I want to ask you one final question. It's a question that I like to ask all of my guests. And that question is, if you could send a message to students and or young adults right now that may be struggling with school, either academically or socially, what message would you like to share with them?
Hmm. Yeah, it's really one word or two words put together, open-hearted. If we can be open-hearted, live an open-hearted life. I mean, that's how we start. We start open-hearted. And as parents, we look at our children and say, I want to keep this going. It's so beautiful. It's so um, everything that humans are meant to be. And then something happens along the way, and the heart closes and reopens and closes. But yeah, if we can stay in touch with our open hearts, one of the things I say is, open-hearted children, open-hearted world. In other words, open-hearted children lead to an open-hearted world. So that means everybody, not just children, because they grow up. So yeah, stay open-hearted in oneself. Stay open-hearted with our relationships with everyone, our teachers, our peers, our family, in the workplace. If you can reveal your open-hearted intentions, then you're going to be a happy person.
I love
That's my
that.
advice.
No, I love that. I think that was perfect. And I think it really speaks true to, by that, having that open heart, what we could accomplish if we were all willing to be open, if we were all willing to be compassionate and have a deeper level of communication with one another, what a difference that would make. Well, before we go, one more time, Gina, would you mind sharing your website? I know you shared it earlier. I want to make sure that everybody has that information, because I really love everything that you shared. I think it is an important tool for not only parents, but teachers, especially right now at this climate and the education setting. So please share that website with the listeners one more time.
Okay, www.teachingfromyourheart.org.
Excellent. Well, Gina, thank you so much for your time today, for sharing this information. This has been fantastic. And I really loved having you as a guest on the Neurodiverse Teacher podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kristen.